introduce this panel, and we'll get started with these great papers. My name is Ben Wise from the University of Florida, and I'm happy to be both the chair and the commenter for this session. And I think what I'll do is I'll just go ahead. I'll just introduce these presenters one by one, and as they finish, I'll introduce the next person. We're going to go in order of the program, which is Rhys Dotson, and then Alecia Long, and then Tim Vale, and then I'll give some comments. I will say that I wasn't able to read Rhys's paper before the panel, and so they're not included in my formal comments, but I'm happy to listen to the presentation and ask questions and talk about it afterwards. So with that said, let me introduce Rhys. For the past 10 years, Rhys has been a lecturer of history and political science at the University of Texas at Tyler. In addition to working at UT Tyler, Rhys is also a doctoral candidate at Texas A&M University. He's in the final stages of writing his dissertation, which focuses on the formation of the LGBT community and its struggle for equal rights in Dallas from 1965 to 2003. So, Rhys, go ahead. It's all yours.
Howdy, guys. Unfortunately, I can't share my screen, so you will just have to imagine these images that I'm trying to tell you as we go along. My paper is entitled Fighting the Pulpit, the Dallas Gay Community and the Resistance to a Cultural Holy War. And the first thing, in order to understand what's going on in the Dallas area in the 1970s, we have to understand the importance of religion to the people who live in the DFW area. We understand that as a part of the Bible Belt, that religion plays an integral part in the lives of many people who live in Dallas. And in fact, in the 1970s, some of the world's largest congregations existed in Dallas. For example, Highland Park Methodist Church was the largest Methodist congregation in the entire country. As the second largest Methodist congregation also existed in Dallas, the Lover's Lane United Methodist Congregation. And collectively, each week, those congregations would serve almost 19,000 members. The largest Presbyterian church in the country was the second largest church in the DFW area. That's Highland Park Presbyterian with 7,000 members. And again, that's the largest in the country for the Presbyterian denomination. Now, a lot of my paper focuses on the events that happened in the late 70s, but one of the things I would like to highlight about the religiousness of Dallas during the 1970s is the Dallas Explo, which takes place in 1972. This is basically what was commonly referred to as the Great Jesus Rally in Dallas. They brought approximately 75,000 teenagers and young adults. The event brought approximately 75,000 teenagers and young adults into the city. It was often touted as the largest of the Jesus movement events. And what they're talking about there with Jesus movement is a growing shift between religious ideologies and conservative political values. So kind of that what we would refer to as pre-moral majority period in the United States. Overall, the Explo did get a lot of local and regional coverage through papers like the Fort Worth Star-Telegram, the Dallas Morning News, the Dallas Times-Herald. On my slideshow, there's a front cover of Life magazine covered the Explo. And the Explo was also covered by the New York Times. But despite the fact that it was covered by these couple of major national media outlets, local people in the Dallas area commonly wrote into letters to the editor to local newspapers about the lack of visual or the lack of recognition of this great Jesus event in Dallas, Texas. So, for example, Charlotte Derian said that national news outlets had failed to properly cover the gigantic demonstrations for Christ, but they consistently covered what she called, quote, demonic demonstrations and drug-ridden festivals of the youth on the coast. It's also notable at Explo that very famous people attended the event, specifically Reverend Billy Graham was there, and music icon Johnny Cash performed at the multi-day event. So this just kind of gives you a flavor of what Dallas is experiencing in the 70s as far as religion is concerned. Now, by the late 70s, Dallas forms its first politically inclined gay organization known as the Dallas Gay Political Caucus. It was formed in the spring of 1976 following an event that two of the members had attended in Houston, and they were inspired by the Houston Gay Political Caucus. So the Dallas Caucus becomes a sister organization to that of Houston. In Dallas, they had very specific goals. They wanted to register and inform voters on any salient issues that were tied to the gay community. And they also wanted to pull together resources to advocate for civil protections and equality in the community. And as I've just spent the last few minutes talking about the importance of religion, it's important to realize that the people who are very active in the gay political caucus are predominantly white men who are very conservative as well. So these are religious people who are participating in the Dallas Gay Political Caucus, and they actually see themselves as a fabric of the Dallas community. And so they're hoping through connections that they would build politically and through churches that they would be able to change the legal protections, if you will, for gay citizens in the city of Dallas. Just after the formation of the Dallas Gay Political Caucus, Anita Bryant came out with her Save the Children, Save Our Children campaign. This is a result of a community measure in Dade County in Florida, trying to extend civil liberty protections to homosexual men and women. Once Anita Bryant, who is very evangelical, very conservative, discovered that this was happening in her backyard, she began protesting and actually was able to roll those protections back. And through her campaign of Save Our Children, she thrust the gay liberation debate onto the national stage. Now, one of the things that Bryant would do is she would stoke those long-held stereotypes about homosexuality, especially gay men, the fact that gay people can't reproduce and make children, so they must recruit from the youth of the population, especially gay men, preying on young boys, and pedophilia. So through that narrative there, Bryant is bringing in a conservative Christian agenda, but also for people who aren't religious, she's scaring them with this idea that gay men are predators and trying to basically adopt or like prey on your children when you're not looking. So she was against like having gay men being teachers and working as like doctors and things like that, because those are professions in which you would commonly open up to and be more susceptible to like trusting the adult in the room, if you will. So Anita Bryant is going to actually come to Hurst, Texas, which is about 170 miles southwest of Dallas. And as Anita Bryant is touring the country and preparing to come to Hurst, Texas, the people of Dallas, the Dallas Gay Political Caucus, begin rallying their supporters. They actually hold numerous events. One of them is a skating party, like at the skating rink. For those of us who are old enough to remember skating rinks. And they raised money so that they could buy advertisements in the Brownwood, they weren't in Hurst, she was in Brownwood, which is 170 miles off the border of Dallas. They were buying advertisements in the local newspaper, comparing the liberties of gay people to the liberties that were outlined by our founding fathers. So even in that protest there, they're not being overly outrageous or demonstrative. They didn't even actually show up in Brownwood. They just bought this newspaper ad trying to argue that they have the same rights and liberties, gay people, as everyone else. Also, the Dallas Gay Political Caucus will put a lot of effort into educational efforts to counter anti-homosexual sentiments in the city during this time period. So our next big challenge for the gay community in Dallas comes in the early spring of 1978, when Reverend B. Clayton Bell will deliver a sermon that specifically addresses the sins of homosexuality. Dr. Bell is the senior minister at Highland Park Presbyterian. So if we remember, that's the second largest congregation in the Dallas area and the largest Presbyterian church in the country. Dr. Bell has a lot of influence, therefore, in the community. Not only is he the senior minister at this congregation, he serves as a trustee on the board of directors at the Presbyterian Hospital of Dallas, and he is the brother-in-law to Reverend Billy Graham. So he has connections to other evangelists outside of the state of Texas on the national scene. In his sermon, he noted a lack of scientific explanation for homosexuality, and he argued that the Bible was the only infallible guide for Christians when trying to decide about the sinfulness or not of homosexuality. Through Bell's biblical arguments, he cited a lot of passages from Genesis and Romans. Specifically, he cited passages about the Apostle Paul writing to the Romans about the sinfulness and debauchery of their society at the time, and targeting specifically homosexuality in Romans 1:26 through 27. He also says through divine design, the female form was made to complement that of the male. Therefore, when you have same-sex relations, you are not following God's design for the body. He also argued homosexuality was the result of a sin-dominated nature, and that if you opposed that belief, or if you didn't agree with that belief, then you were simply judging homosexuality through the lens of pleasure and selfish gain. Finally, in this sermon, as he's like building his argument, he starts to link homosexuality to pedophilia. And he specifically references this organization known as the Pedophile Information Exchange, also known as PI, which was based out of London, England at the time. And in this organization in England, they specifically recruited or asked for or advocated for the lowering of the age of consent below the age of 17. And they asked for civil and legal protections for pedophilia in England through British law. So again, Bell here is using a religious argument to be against homosexuality, but also anyone who might not be buying into that argument, he's stoking that fear of the predatory nature of gay men that has no scientific findings. So he's increasing that fear of gay men. Also, despite the fact that he mentions the Pedophile Information Exchange, he fails to mention that every major homosexual organization in the United States and in Europe completely discredited PI and had no connections to them whatsoever. So this is something that, again, is a fear-mongering tactic used by people on the right to scare people off about homosexuality. Bell argues that there's a slippery slope. He said that humans had progressed from idolatry to immorality, and now through the acceptance of things like homosexuality, the people, especially the United States, was moving beyond immorality into homosexuality and a host of other sins. And by accepting these behaviors, essentially your community would experience an increase in sinful behaviors and fall into a system of debauchery. So he's really, laying it on thick in this sermon. He concludes that the Christian response was that Christians had their duty to recognize and call out sin, and that they should help homosexuals overcome their sin. He also advised that Christians should neither judge nor condemn nor condone gay men and women, and that through love and concern, Christians should be able to lead people to a godly state, and that godly state would either be a life of celibacy or becoming heterosexual. So kind of that love the sinner, not the sin mentality that we're probably more familiar with in the modern era. After the airing of this sermon, the Dallas Gay Political Caucus will respond to Bell. And in fact, they openly invited him or one of his associate ministers to discuss homosexuality with them, which he declined, and they could never get a hold of any of the associate ministers. They produced a 10-page rebuttal to Bell's claims and specifically referenced new challenges from both scientists and respected biblical and theological scholars to kind of push back against Bell's claims. Specifically, the caucus was concerned with Bell's what they call traditional negative approach and condemnation of homosexuality. They balked at the idea that Bell's claim was that the Bible was the only source for Christians to rely on for guidance. And in that regard, they specifically referred to Reverend George P. McLeod, who was a prominent Presbyterian at the time, who said the continual revelation of God in history was recognized by Presbyterians as complementary to the Holy Scripture. So through science and understanding and reason over time, those items can also help inform the modern Christian about the path that God would prefer Christians to take. In addition to this response, the Dallas Gay Political Caucus hosted a religious conference, a one-day conference on April 1st, 1978, called Homosexuality, Questions for the Church and Society. Through this conference, they were attempting to foster communications between both the religious and gay communities. They relied on notable scholars and theologians to present at the conference. And in addition, they also, instead of kind of just holding this for people who would be pro-homosexuality, they were very forthright in advertising the conference in all major local newspapers and on local television affiliates of ABC and CBS. So trying to get as many people as possible to come out. Again, they extended an invitation to Dr. Bell, who refused to accept. While at the conference, the keynote speaker was Dr. W. Norman Pittinger. He was a notable theologian who taught at Oxford University in England. And he had written a book, two specific books called Making Sexuality Human and Gay Lifestyles. He'd actually written over 50 manuscripts relating to the Bible. The caucus also brought in Dr. Robert Oakes. He was an assistant professor of history at UT Arlington, and he discussed his research on homosexuality in the American colonial era. Dr. Victor P. Furnish was a professor of the New Testament at SMU. He came in, and his big push during this conference was to emphasize the importance of proper translation of ancient texts, and that by relying on some of the earlier translations that had not been refined yet, you could get a misreading or misinterpretation of the Bible. Overall, the conference pulled in more than 200 members, and the caucus surmised that it was the first time that anything of this magnitude had been held in their part of the country. And they also hoped that this would further invigorate conversations between the gay community and religious communities, and that other gay organizations across the state and country would engage in similar conferences. About a year later, televangelist and the host of James Robison Presents, James Robison, delivered a sermon on his nationally syndicated television show called A Nation That Forgets God, was the name of the sermon. And during this televised sermon, he referred to homosexuals as despicable, and he claimed that homosexuality was a perversion to the highest order. And while giving his sermon, he held up and referenced the National Enquirer, that great publication, the National Enquirer. And he claimed that gay men, based on the information in the National Enquirer, gay men actively seduced young boys and led them into sex work. And then he drew correlations between the Jonestown suicides, which the Jonestown cult started in San Francisco, the zebra killings, which were earlier killings between a group of Black Muslim men who were racially motivated, killing white people in San Francisco, and the Harvey Milk assassination as all examples that San Francisco was turning into America's modern Sodom and Gomorrah. As soon as this program ended, the Dallas Gay Political Caucus contacted the local station that Robison would televise from, and they claimed that Robison had violated the Fairness Doctrine, the FCC's Fairness Doctrine, which basically means that he failed to present a balanced perspective concerning a controversial issue. The caucus asked for and received time to respond to Robison's claims. And then ultimately, the station's board of directors decided to drop James Robison Presents from their programming, predominantly because he had been warned for comments that he had made in the past, specifically about the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. So this was a repeat offense for him. Of course, once they had dropped his program, Robison responded by saying that his First Amendment rights had been violated, and that he feared that if the government continued to be involved in the airing of what could be aired on television, that Bible preachers would not be able to point out the moral decay of the country. And within the Southern Baptist community, he often scoffed at the idea of allowing the caucus to respond, but publicly he said that he had no problem with the caucus responding to his claims. And Robeson often suggested that the caucus had actually requested his cancellation, which they vehemently denied. And there's no proof to say that they did that. Of course, support for Robeson and the WFAA flooded local news outlets. The caucus said that their main objection was Robeson leaving the boundaries of theology, specifically when he links homosexuality to crimes ranging from child molestation and murder. Ultimately, the caucus stated that they believed that Robeson wanted unrestricted authority to share his opinions on human behavior, whether they were factual or not. Because of all of the blowback that the WFFA station received from canceling of Robeson's show, the station manager, David Lane, actually offered to reinstate the program if the televangelist was prepared to follow FCC guidelines. Robeson will reject that offer, and he will continue his petition onto the federal commission to see so that they could rule that if he, in fact, did violate the fairness doctrine or not. Spokesperson for Robeson, Mike Huckabee, suggested that returning to air would be a concession to Robeson's deeply held convictions and a loss of his personal integrity. So they're using this now, despite the fact that he had used a National Enquirer paper to base his claims off of. Now they're turning it into a fight against government, big government, having too much oversight. Robeson and his organization formed the National Call to Arms Committee, where they aim to raise $15 million for a primetime special called End of Outrage. And they organized the Freedom to Preach rally at the Dallas Convention Center on June 5th, 1979. Robeson initially had invited Anita Bryant to perform at that event, but then he will later rescind that invitation. And publicly, he says that he did this because he had received death threats for Anita Bryant and himself. But his lawyers, in documents that have been uncovered since, suggested that he not bring a Bryant in because it would potentially cloud the real issue. And they feared that her presence would gain too much support or attention for the gay community. So that's really the reason why he eliminated her from the evening. So ultimately what we see is Robeson is centering his fight on against censure, against, again, government oversight, and the government preventing them from spreading God's word. Prior to the rally, over 150 Dallas area ministers listed their name and congregation in support of Robeson. He had listed took out an entire ad of all the local newspapers advertising the Freedom to Preach rally. At the rally, we see some prominent guests. The Reverend W.A. Criswell of First Baptist Dallas attended. Jerry Falwell was there. And Robeson's lawyer, Richard Raysource Haynes, out of Houston, was there to make sure that the correct message was being presented. At the end, Huckabee claimed that more than 10,000 people had attended the event. And he said that the excitement and fervor was so great that had they suggested that their members or their attendees go and destroy the WFAA building brick by brick, they would have absolutely done so. Overall, at the end of that night, they had raised $82,000 for the cause for Robeson's fight against the FCC. What's really interesting, though, as historians, we often place the rise of moral majority with the beginning of this Christian conservative movement. But in reflection, Mike Huckabee says that the Freedom to Preach rally was really the beginning of that true beginning of the Christian conservative movement. And through things like the legalization of abortion, increased visibility of homosexuality, and a push for sexual and gender equality only propelled Christians more towards political activism. And as a result of this, Christians viewed the cancellation of James Robeson Presents as the opening shot in the cultural holy war that would follow into the 1980s. Overall, by the end of June of 1979, Robeson had returned to the airwaves of WFAA. In a joint statement, Robeson stated with David Lane, the station manager, Robeson stated that he had a clear understanding of the station's program policies, but he staunchly denied that he was compromising his beliefs. Now, for the rest of the summer and into the fall, Robeson will continue rallying against what he called big government and government overreach. But the Dallas Gay Political Caucus continued their fight for equality. They ran petitions to challenge the Texas sodomy law 2106. And ultimately, that will be a claim to that will be filed at the end of the 1970s, which I believe Timothy is going to talk about. And then we also see that the Dallas Gay Political Caucus worked tirelessly to send a group of people to the National March on Washington for Lesbian and Gay Rights, which took place in October of 1979. And through their mobilization, they actually purchased billboards in the city of Dallas to advertise the National March on Washington. So despite the fact that you see this ramping up of religious discontent towards homosexuality, the Dallas Gay Political Caucus continued to push and they continued their fight towards equality in spite of being labeled as sexual predators and these for lack of a better word, heretics against God. So that is kind of how we see that the Dallas Gay Political Caucus has been pushing back against this religious holy war that started in the 1970s and leads us into the 1980s.
All right. Good job. I'll clap on behalf of everybody in the room.
Thank you.
There you go. Okay, good job. Thanks for that, Rhys. Now let me take a second to introduce Alecia Long, who will go next. Alecia is the John L. Lewis and Paul W. and Nancy Murrell Professor in the Department of History at LSU. She teaches courses on several aspects of Louisiana history and is the author of The Great Southern Babylon, Sex, Race, and Respectability in New Orleans, 1865 to 1920, which came out in 2004. And she's also the co-editor with Leon White's of Occupied Women, Gender, Military Occupation, and the American Civil War from 2009. Her new book, from which this talk is drawn, is called Cruising for Conspirators, How a New Orleans DA Prosecuted the Kennedy Assassination as a Sex Crime, which was published just a month and a half ago by UNC Press. So, Alecia.
Hey, good morning, everyone. Thank you, Ben. I'm going to make one last attempt to share my PowerPoint because I think I might have figured it out. There we go. Can everybody see that?
All right. Well done.
All right. Yeah. Okay. So we're going to start the slideshow here. Just give me 1 second. I think I can make this work. Well, we're going to try it this way. So sorry, I'm having trouble with the controls, but at least we have some pictures. So I'm pretty happy about that. So let's go. So most of you know, I assume, that John F. Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas, Texas on November 22nd, 1963. So how does a crime that occurred in Texas, a couple of crimes, in fact, wind up being adjudicated in a conspiracy case in Louisiana? The first answer to that question is in the person of Lee Harvey Oswald, who was a New Orleans native and had spent the summer before the assassination in his hometown. And so rumors that are spread about Oswald's activities in New Orleans during the summer of 1963 sort of lay at the heart of what ultimately brings this case to Louisiana. Oswald certainly will not return because he is shot and killed by Jack Ruby on November 24th, 1963. 10 months later, the Warren Commission would conclude that Oswald was the lone gunman, that Ruby had also acted alone, and that the commission had uncovered no evidence of a foreign or domestic conspiracy, at least to that point. And part of what I'm doing in the book, Cruising for Conspirators, is moving away from these questions that still remain at the center of debates regarding the Kennedy assassination. So there's a very broad there's a very deep literature that litigates these questions, but the question set regarding the aftermath of the situation, I don't think is broad enough. And so what I've tried to do in Cruising for Conspirators is to move sexuality to the foreground of thinking about the Warren Commission forward. And so here's just a quick example. from the Warren report, dozens of witnesses were queried about Oswald and Ruby's sexuality. And here's a brief quote. This is the most direct mention in the central report. The commission has investigated rumors that Jack Ruby and Lee Harvey Oswald were both homosexuals and thus might have known each other in that respect. However, no evidence has been uncovered to support the rumors. The closest acquaintances of both men emphatically deny them, and Ruby's nightclubs were not known to have been frequented by homosexuals. I think what's significant about this is that this is a chapter on possible conspiracies. And so you can already see that there's an overlap in thinking about whether or not some sort of homosexual cabal and relationships between homosexual men might have some relationship to the carrying out of the assassination. And those same kind of ideas are going to exist in New Orleans in the earliest New Orleans-based conspiracy theories. And those are offered by two people with previously troubled reputations who tell two different stories to first local authorities and then to the FBI and the Secret Service in the week after the assassination. Those two people are Jack Martin and a lawyer named Dean Adams Andrews. Jack Martin is what you might call a courthouse character, a known alcoholic, a person who had spent time in the mental or the psychiatric wing of Charity Hospital. But he begins calling law enforcement officials on the weekend after the assassination, and he insists that Lee Harvey Oswald was associated with a man he knew named David Ferry. David Ferry had a checkered legal past, including accusations of having participated in sex acts with teenage boys. And so Martin says that there's some sort of relationship between these two men, and that Ferry might have sort of put Oswald up to the assassination. The other person, lawyer Dean Andrews, also tells a very complicated story about three gay kids, what he calls a Texas-born Mexican, and a man named Clay Bertrand, who came into his law office the summer before the assassination with Lee Harvey Oswald. What's important about these two stories is that the only things they have in common, they're told separately by two separate people, that they both featured Lee Harvey Oswald and allegations of homosexuality. So that's very important to the themes I'm developing in the book. And the short answer of how these cases sort of, or this case ultimately reached New Orleans is this person, District Attorney Jim Garrison, who is District Attorney of Orleans Parish, so that includes New Orleans, between 1962 and 1974. And what he will ultimately do is what I call in the book, merge and massage those two stories, which are initially separate, and come up with a new trio of conspirators, David Ferry, Lee Harvey Oswald, and the elusive Clay Bertrand, who people had been searching for, including the Warren Commission, since 1964. Now, Garrison was an extraordinarily, let's say, aggressive prosecutor, but also extremely ambitious. And through a series of events, he becomes almost untouchable in Louisiana politics. He makes some very good political moves. He wins the United States Supreme Court case. He supports a long shot governor. And so by the time he reaches his second term in beginning of 1965, he is basically untouchable and has no effective oversight. And so one of the things that he decides to do, like so many people are by around the third anniversary of the assassination, is to look into lingering questions about the assassination and revisit the conclusions of the Warren Commission report. And because he is so ambitious and is continually courting the press, he makes a deal with Life magazine, wherein he brings in Life magazine reporters who are given inside access to his investigation and to investigative steps taken in that investigation. And so you can see in one of these slides that Life magazine photographers are literally taking photographs of alleged participants or suspects from behind a two-way mirror in the district attorney's office. And the person who is pictured on the other side is Clay Shaw. And this is a person who Jim Garrison decides was the elusive Clay Bertrand, and that he had used that as an alias in the homosexual underworld, is the way Garrison described it. And he comes up with the idea that there had been a homosexual thrill killing, and that Lee Harvey Oswald, David Ferry, and Clay Shaw as Clay Bertrand had participated in this conspiracy. So that's the basic grounds upon which he arrests Clay Shaw on March 1, 1967. By that time, of course, his alleged co-conspirators, Lee Harvey Oswald and David Ferrie, are both dead. And so he is the alleged man holding the bag in this supposed homosexual thrill-killing plot to take out President Kennedy. And after his arrest, there is a search warrant issued for his home, and Life magazine photographers also accompany Jim Garrison's investigators into Shaw's home and document the search of his home, and also document materials that were removed from his home. And these are things are difficult to see, but there are pictures of males, nude males on the desk, and similar kinds of materials which are recorded in these Life magazine photographs, which were never published and which I found impossible to publish even at this point. But evidence seized in that search was treated in ways that we would certainly consider disturbing today in terms of chain of evidence. And one group of materials that are seized from Shaw's home suggest a kind of very active BDSM life and practice on the part of Clay Shaw. And this also is part of the way that Garrison uses cultural prejudice against not just homosexual men, but particularly people who are involved in what are then considered depraved activities like BDSM. And what's so striking about this is that this evidence transported from Clay Shaw's home to the district attorney's office is then transported to Garrison's suburban home, where he takes part in what I can only believe is an extraordinarily improper photo session in which he is photographed with Clay Shaw's whips and chain segments. And he almost looks like a game show host in this particular image that I'm showing you now. Here are some other parts of that life photo shoot in the den of his suburban New Orleans home. And these were made as part of a prospective story about his investigation in the making and in the early days after Shaw's arrest. And so these photographs provide evidence that certainly this angle of Shaw's sexuality, and particularly his deviant homosexual activity related to bondage, domination, and sadomasochism, is somehow involved in his plotting with two other men, both alleged to be homosexual or bisexual, and planning the president's murder. And if these photographs don't provide evidence enough that that was an important strand in the investigation's early days, this particular document also helps to show that this was the case. This is a document dated March 13th, so about 12 days after Clay Shaw's arrest. Those photographs that I just showed you were made probably 2 or 3 days after Clay Shaw's arrest. And so this is March 13, 1967. It's from one of Jim Garrison's investigators, a guy named John Bolts. And I'll just read it quickly. On March 10, 1967, I brought various pieces of evidence in the Clay Shaw matter to Dr. Robert Heath at Tulane University. He was a very well-known psychiatrist at that time. And in fact, Tulane's School of Psychiatry is still named after Robert Heath. And after Dr. Heath examined it, I had an interview with him on March 11th, at which time he told me that Shaw's motive, as you, Garrison, suggested, could very possibly have been rooted in his sadistic homosexual abnormality. He gave me the attached and told me that he would be happy to discuss it with you. And what was attached is a longer form article about criminality among people with deviant sexual behavior, identities, and practices. So this is somewhat disturbing, I think. And I will just say that one of the lines of argument about Jim Garrison's investigation is that this preoccupation with a homosexual motive in the case was really quite short-lived over the course of his investigation. And in fact, what I found to be the case with much of the material in the Kennedy assassination literature more generally, and the Garrison investigation most specifically, is that most writers get very hung up on very polarized interpretations of that investigation, right? And so the sort of basic line of argument is Garrison was right and Clay Shaw was guilty, or Garrison was wrong and Clay Shaw was a victim. And so that is often where the argument begins and ends. And in recent years, there has been a closer examination by myself and by another author named Fred Litwin who have taken this question of the role that sexuality played in Jim Garrison's investigation far more seriously. And so this is a cover of an article that appeared in Confidential magazine in August of 1968. Now, Shaw will go on trial in February of 1969. So this is sort of a very far into the trajectory of the 2 years that lapsed between his arrest on March 1, 1967, and the beginning of his trial in February of 1969. And you'll see here that this story by Joel Palmer was titled The Kennedy Assassination, A Study in Perversion. And beyond just the sort of way in which the assassination of Kennedy is characterized as a sick and vicious homosexual plot, you can also see that then this gets connected up to this idea that if Kennedy had lived, there would have been other different kinds of outcomes in American politics. And so this is a great tragedy brought to you by a group of scheming homosexual conspirators. And what's interesting about the story beyond that, and this is not the only one of its kind, there are several stories of this type, is that it's very clear that the author, Joel Palmer, received assistance with this story directly from the Garrison investigation, that some of the information that they had and some of the quote unquote evidence that they presented could only have come from inside the Garrison investigation. And so this shows us, and there's a lot of other evidence that I'm not going to talk about today, but there's an enormous amount of other evidence that suggests that this continues to be a preoccupation within the investigation up to Shaw's trial and for a long period of time after that, where they continue to try to find these links between gay men. In this Confidential magazine story, you can see that homosexual number 1 is Lee Harvey Oswald. Homosexual number 2 is Jack Ruby. Homosexual number 3 is David Ferry. All of these men dead by the time Shaw goes on trial. And homosexual number 4, Clay Bertrand Shaw. And the sort of critical thread of evidence is based on the testimony of one witness who emerges right before Clay Shaw's arrest on March 1, 1967, who claims that he heard Lee Harvey Oswald, David Ferry, and Clay Bertrand having a conspiratorial conversation about possibly assassinating the president. And Jim Garrison filed conspiracy charges against Clay Shaw in Louisiana in his home district for a crime that took place in Dallas, Texas. And he could do that because the bar for conviction on a conspiracy case in Louisiana is pretty low. And all that has to happen to charge and then find somebody guilty of conspiracy is that 2 or more parties had to have a conversation about a potential criminal act. And then 1 or more of those parties has to have taken an act in furtherance of that conspiratorial act. And so all that Garrison had to prove is that Clay Shaw had this conspiratorial conversation. And then they came up with a whole laundry list of acts that things that it was known he had done in the aftermath of the assassination that they characterized as somehow taking part in a cover-up of the assassination conspiracy, including a trip he took to San Francisco when the assassination occurred. So this is, it's a low legal bar, but even with that being the case, Garrison was not able to get a jury to find Clay Shaw guilty. Clay Shaw was exonerated by a unanimous jury verdict as not guilty on March 1, 1969. And at this point, I'm going to come back to me, I think. Let me try to just close the PowerPoint and come back to the conversation. And I just want to say that what I'm trying to do in Cruising for Conspirators is move us away from this lone gunman or conspiracy way of thinking about the assassination and its aftermath, but also encouraging other historians to tap into what is an extraordinarily rich archive that has been assembled at the National Archives related to the Kennedy assassination. And what I really believe and in fact know is that it is possible to do a very rich variety of historical study out of those documents that touch in some ways on the Kennedy assassination, but do not stay preoccupied with these same questions that people are asking 58 years after the fact, right? We're coming up on that 58th anniversary. And so I'll just say, briefly, I'm sure some of you know that there were QAnon advocates in Dealey Plaza this week looking for the return of JFK and JFK Jr. As the two parties who would sweep Donald Trump back into the White House. And they were disappointed in that wishful and magical thinking. But a lot of what is known and thought about Clay Shaw is also a result of Oliver Stone's work in the 1991 film JFK, where Stone really uses quite abusive characterizations of gay men to sort of make his larger point about a conspiracy in the assassination. Stone is about to release a new documentary in the US called JFK Revisited, and where, there's a 2-hour version and a 4-hour version where these lone gunmen or conspiracy questions are going to be adjudicated ad nauseum once again. And so I think Cruising for Conspirators is a brief about that case in particular and the role Sexuality and homophobia in particular played in that case. But I think it's also a recall for historians to stop leaving that field of inquiry to people who only want to argue the same questions over and over again, and start to use that very rich archive in new ways that can enrich the history of sexuality, the history of the South, and sort of history of the 20th century more generally. So I will stop there. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Alecia. All right, let me introduce our last panelist, Timothy Vale. Attended the University of Houston, getting a bachelor's degree in history in 2013. He returned to the University of Houston in 2015 as a master's student and then transferred into the PhD program in 2016. His focus is on the history of American medicine, infectious diseases, and LGBT history. His dissertation examines HIV/AIDS in Houston and compares it nationally to places like Los Angeles and New York in terms of public health, alternative medicine, and local gay community programs and municipal health initiatives. So without further ado, Timothy.
All right, good. All right, thank you, Ben. I'm going to go ahead and try to do the same thing Alecia just did. All righty, so I'm just going to leave it there just like Alecia did and go ahead and get started. So good morning, everybody. I'm Timothy Vale, and I am here to present from the bedroom to the courthouse, the Baker versus Wade case and its impact during the AIDS crisis. So I guess it's best to start off with the man himself, since this is a trial about a personal examination of one person, and it's best to start off with that. The man at the center of what would later be known as the Baker versus Wade case, Donald Baker, was born on April 24th, 1947 in Dallas to a devout religious family of the Assembly of God denomination. And this religious upbringing would become a central part of Baker's life, being in the church choir as well as an Eagle Scout during his youth. In 1965, Baker graduated from high school and attended East Texas State for 2 years before transferring to the University of Texas at Austin, where he began to realize he was sexually attracted to other men. Fearing his homosexuality would clash with his Christian faith, Baker left the school in May of 1968 on the advice from a school psychiatrist to join the Navy, who argued that, quote, his homosexual tendencies could be eradicated through more rigorous engagement with masculine activities such as the military. After serving with the Navy for 4 years, Baker was honorably discharged in 1972, but was still struggling with his sexuality and continued to attend church while enrolling in State University of New York at Cortland to finish his degree in elementary and secondary school education, graduating in 1975. During his time at Cortland, Baker encountered the local gay liberation group on campus, and from there finally came to terms with his sexuality. Returning to his home that same year, Baker announced to his family and his church congregation that he was gay. And while there was some initial fear and skepticism on the part of his family and his church friends, they eventually came to embrace him. And all throughout all throughout this, Baker still maintained his very spiritual and religious beliefs. And along with this, his passion for gay liberation ignited a passion for gay politics that would cause him to frequently clash with other members of the congregation. But all throughout, he tried to adapt uh, a peaceful manner in which to foster understanding and change within his denomination. His faith and belief still remained central to his life. In the fall of 1975, Baker was hired by the Dallas Independent School District, and for the next 4 years, he taught fourth through sixth grade language and social studies classes, becoming a very well-loved and well-respected teacher by both his students and faculty. It was also during it was also during this time that Baker became more politically active in the Dallas gay community. That same year that Baker began his job, he, along with four individuals, would go on to create the first major LGBT organization in Dallas, the Dallas Gay Political Caucus, which Rhys has already done a great job discussing. Baker and the other members would attend several rallies throughout the following years, pushing for gay rights, and he would become more visible, and he knew that this was only going to be a matter of time before he was going to be publicly outed. Because at the time, homosexuality not only was still a mental illness, there was still a lot of hysteria, especially in the Dallas area, especially with parents in fears that homosexuals were infiltrating schools um, to mingle with children and eventually prey on them. And this hysteria was so great that Dallas Independent School District Superintendent Nolan Estes even publicly declared in a news interview that there were no homosexual teachers in the Dallas School District, but if they were, they would be fired immediately. Um, the superintendent's intention to not only rid the school district of teachers based on their sexuality um, would have a dire effect when in 1977 Baker was publicly Baker during an interview with a local Dallas TV station came out publicly and admitted his homosexuality, and from there it spiraled from there. And in 1978, the Dallas Independent School District was notified of that interview and told Baker that he was going to be fired for being homosexual. A friend of his, Harriet Earnhardt, who was a fellow teacher at the same school as Baker, recalled that same night that he announced his firing, that we met personally the next evening uh, after his termination. He as a teacher in one room, and I as a member of the Dallas Independent School Board in another, talking through a door. Very shortly, Don burst through the door and said, "I am not going to do this anymore. I'm not going to hide anymore." Baker's declaration would be the start of a very long legal proceeding that would send ripples throughout the state and ultimately overturn Texas's sodomy law that was in place. But to understand that case, I first want to examine the law in question itself. So, the law in question in regards to this whole legal case, and ultimately at the heart of this very presentation today, is on Texas Penal Code, Title 5, Offenses Against the Person, Chapter 21, Sexual Offenses, Section 2106. So, to understand the law itself, I want to start in 1974. In 1974, the newest version of the Texas Penal Code went into effect, and one of the newest sections was one that amended the state sodomy statute, which previously defined sodomy as any sort of non-reproductive sexual act, either both homosexual and heterosexual. However, in 1970, a federal court in Dallas ruled in a court case titled Buchanan versus Bachelor that the Texas sodomy law of the 1940s was unconstitutional as it violated a heterosexual married couple's right to privacy. Um, However, the ruling did nothing to address homosexuality, and in response, the state revised its penal code in 1974 and revised it to explicitly target homosexuality. This new section, Section 2106, for short, sodomy was now considered to be an exclusively homosexual act in which a person commits an offense if he engages in a deviant sexual intercourse with another individual, and was guilty of thus a Class C misdemeanor, which was punishable by a fine at the time not exceeding $500. This statute effectively made anyone caught or admitting to homosexuality a criminal, which not only subjected them to the punishments of the law, it more importantly put individuals at risk from being fired from their jobs, ostracized from their communities. As one local Texas gay man put it at the time, quote, "The real damage of the law was that it inscribed criminality into the homosexual body and made a homosexual person a criminal, and thus unworthy of participating in society." Now, while there were some prominent state politicians at this time, including State Attorney General Jim Maddox, who did occasionally voice skepticism of the 2106 law, stating that it was unenforceable, the great majority of elected officials, county and statewide, all had no interest in taking up the issue and legality of the law due to the fact that the homosexual panic and the rise of the Christian moral majority made it a very toxic issue to touch for many elected officials. So for gay activists then, the best hope for removing 2106 was determined to eventually be judicial action through the courts. And this brings us to what was eventually known as the THRC, the THRF. In early 1976, 4 gay activists in the city of Houston created an organization initially called the Houston Human Rights Defense Foundation, with the principal goal of attacking the 2106 law in federal court. These individuals included Robert Morton Schwab, you can see pictured left, Gary Van Uytgen to the right, as well as Keith McGee and Gary Rather, with Mort Schwab taking the main leadership role. After 2 years without any real meaningful financial or political support for the organization, the group decided to rebrand as the Texas Human Rights Foundation and expand their focus not just in Houston, but the entire state as well, drawing in the cities of Dallas, Houston, and San Antonio. And in 1978, Dick Peoples, a member of the Dallas Gay Political Caucus, was added to the THRF board. And it was during this time that Peoples suggested to Schwab and the other members who were beginning to discuss ways in which to attack the 2106 law to maybe look at his friend, Don Baker, who was going through his own legal battle with the Dallas Independent School District. With that in mind, former board member Mike Anglin later recalled that the decision to attack the 2106 in federal court on the grounds that it violated a person's Fourth Amendment right to privacy. Quote, we chose the federal courts because of the developing laws on the rights of privacy under the Constitution, something not expressed in so many words in the Constitution per se, but which the justices of the Supreme Court had been finding to exist in other cases as an underlying illumination of the Bill of Rights. This new approach to understanding the Constitution had been the basis of Supreme Court decisions, setting aside, for example, the Connecticut law, which prohibited doctors from advising their patients on effective contraception, and of course the Virginia law, which forbade interracial marriage. So with that in mind, the THRF began to search out for an attorney who would be willing to take on the case. And they found their man in Dallas trial lawyer Jim Barber, who was known for handling federal and constitutional litigation with openly liberal political leanings. Barber agreed and detailed exactly what he was looking for in a perfect trial candidate. It had to be someone that was both very presentable and willing to be the public face of the litigation, since he stated that there was likely to be a good deal of media attention, most of it probably hostile, as soon as the case was made public. It had to be someone who was articulate, dignified, respectable, well-versed, or at least trainable in constitutional issues, and also a well-liked member of the community in order to help secure donations and political support as needed. And ideally, it would have to be someone who had experienced the discriminatory side effects of the statute and would be likely to experience that in the future. With that in mind, Dick People suggested Don Baker as the perfect candidate due to Baker's spotless record, a devout Christian belief and upbringing, and pretty much universally liked. During this time, by 1978, Baker was already in the motions of filing a civil suit against his former employer and was contacted by both Peoples and Barber and asked him if he would like to serve as the test case for the 2106 case. And after some thought, Baker agreed. And on November 19, 1979, the suit was filed in the United States District Court for the Northern District of Texas with Dallas County District Attorney Henry Wade and Dallas City Attorney Lee Holt as the defendants. The THRF also included the 1,085 city, county, and district attorneys in the suit, as well as THRF hoped that in the event of a successful ruling that would apply statewide. In June of 1981, the case finally made its way to District Court Judge Jerry Buchmeyer, and for 2 days, attorneys on both sides presented their arguments, with Barber and the THRF arguing that 2106 was not only unconstitutional, but also unenforceable. Meanwhile, Wade and the defense argued that the state still had a moral obligation to regulate sexual behavior. And as you can see here, this is one of the many photos of Barber, Baker, as well as a fellow friend of Baker's and Dallas State Political Caucus member Bill Nelson, interviewing reporters during and after the trial. This is one of them. And after hearing arguments, Buchmeyer would spend the next month and a half deliberating before finally handing down his verdict on August 17, 1982, declaring 2106 violated both Baker's and all homosexuals' right to privacy, as well as being in violation of the Equal Protection Clause for the 14th Amendment, and that the state did not have a legal authority to regulate sexual behavior and conduct, with his most iconic quote being, quote, the right of privacy does extend to private sexual conduct between consenting adults, whether husband and wife, unmarried males and females, or homosexuals, and the right of equal protection condemns a state statute which, like 2106, prohibits homosexual sodomy but not heterosexual sodomy without any rational basis. Baker's victory over the 2106 law instantly made him a hero throughout the state of Texas. And for the next several weeks, Baker and his legal team would travel to all corners of the state, holding interviews, conducting fundraisers, and becoming the guest of honor for several different organizations' celebrations. He was, in the words of one Dallas lesbian, quote, our own modern day Abraham Lincoln. This day makes me think back in history to 1862, when slavery was made illegal and the slaves were freed. I'm sure that the sense of freedom feels the same 120 years later to the gay people of Texas. With everyone celebrating, Baker was quick to urge caution that, quote, our community feels that the gay cause has now been totally championed. It hasn't. There is still an element in society that is so dreadfully misunderstands us. We must share the facts about who we are and what we are about on a one-to-one basis with family, friends, and acquaintances. It is only by this personal strategy that we will truly win the hearts and minds of most Texans. While many gay Texans continued to celebrate the victory and Baker continued his speaking tours throughout 1982 and into 1983, for his cautious optimism for the future, tragedy in the form of a pandemic disease would soon sweep through the United States. Morton Schwab, who had been such an influential role in the foundation of the THRF and a good friend to Baker, was one of the first gay men in Texas to succumb to the mysterious autoimmune disease dubbed Acquired Immune Deficiency Syndrome, or AIDS, in December of 1983. Feeling the loss of such a pivotal figure during his funeral, Baker expressed the heartbreak at losing such a powerful member of the community. Quote, Robert, and I were comrades in arms over these years. His loss extends to not only to the entire state, but I am deeply saddened that we have lost such a pillar of the movement and a deep personal friend. While Baker would continue to remain optimistic for the future for himself and his fellow gay and lesbian Texans, the following years proved to be even more full of challenges. From 1984 to 1985, AIDS continued to spread rapidly throughout the state of Texas, fueled in part by both a lack of knowledge as to what exactly caused the disease, but also by a lack of urgency on the part of state government and on the state government, with the cities of Houston and Dallas bearing the brunt of this for the state of Texas, and becoming two of the nation's highest number of cases, with Houston becoming the fourth largest by 1985 and Dallas the ninth. While most cities in Texas, including Houston, did kind of notice a small drop off in the number of cases in 1985 with 170 as compared to 1984 with 166, Dallas, on the meanwhile, saw a significant jump with 75 in 1984 and 100 new cases in 1985. The visibility of the rising number of AIDS cases and the seriousness of the disease was not far from the mind of Baker, who, in a letter to the editor of the Dallas Morning News, chastised the growing paranoia and bigotry coming from both the public and religious right, arguing that, quote, "It seems that there is still that reactionary right-wing element in our city that would rather find a scapegoat for AIDS rather than approach it from a logical, humane, and religiously responsible angle." Yet during all this, Baker still remained hopeful that the future, arguing that, quote, "true compassion and understanding, that this is more representative of our citizenry, will get it together and support local agencies and organizations that are better able to address this crisis." However, Baker's attention would soon be diverted away from AIDS and back towards the courthouse when in April of 1984, Potter County District Attorney Danny Hill, responsible for the city of Amarillo in North Texas, with the support of several religious right groups, including the Dallas Doctors Against AIDS, a blatantly homophobic organization that was formed in January of '84 to push for harsh quarantine public health measures that specifically targeted the gay community in the name of AIDS, helped Hill file an appeal with the Fifth U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals in New Orleans to have them overturn Buchmeyer's ruling on the Baker case and reinstitute 2106 on the grounds that Buchmeyer overstepped his boundaries as a district court judge. On September 21st, 1984, a three-judge panel of the Fifth Circuit struck down the appeal, arguing that Hill and his co-members did not have any right to appeal. And while Baker and the Texas Gay and Lesbian celebrated the decision, it was soon cut short when in early 1985, the Fifth Circuit announced that it would hear the Baker case and Hill's appeal, but this time it would involve the entire 16-judge panel. On Monday, June 17th, 1985, Baker and his legal team, led by Barber and the THRF, appeared in the Circuit Court of New Orleans along with Hill and the Dallas Doctors Against AIDS to petition their arguments in court. To the surprise of both groups, the Fifth Circuit Court initially seemed less interested in the issue of homosexuality, but more so on two legal technicalities of the case. One being that whether or not District Attorney Danny Hill had the jurisdiction and right to appeal, and two, did the Attorney General Jim Maddox have the right to initially dismiss Hill's initial petition of the case, which left Baker and the gay and lesbian communities hopeful that Buchmeyer's ruling would initially stand. Yet their hopes were soon dashed 2 months later on August 26th, when the Fifth Circuit Court ruled in a very tight 9-7 ruling that 2106 was still constitutional, with the majority arguing that, quote, "in the view of the strong objection to homosexual conduct which has prevailed in Western culture for the past 7 centuries, we cannot say that Section 2106 is totally unrelated to the pursuit of implementing morality as a permissible goal. Therefore, 2106 does not deprive Baker of equal protection of the laws, because we hold that Section 2106 is constitutional. The injunction of the district court is vacated and the judgment is reversed. Shocked but not undeterred, Baker and the THRF announced it would begin the process for appealing to the U.S. Supreme Court, and on January 18, 1986, had filed a writ of certiorari. However, by the time that writ had been filed, the Supreme Court had already accepted the Bauer versus Hardwick case on the Georgia sodomy law, and in June of that year, the Supreme Court ruled that there was no right to privacy to engage in sodomy and promptly dismissed Baker's writ on July 7th, thus ending any legal hope of challenging 2106 for the near future. The Bowers decision proved to be a devastating blow to the hopes of gay Texans, especially considering how fast Buchmeyer's historic ruling was reversed. But for Baker, he remained undaunted by the legal setbacks. Quote, "I can make an analogy of crossing the English Channel," Baker said in an interview with the Dallas Times-Herald in the week after the Bowers-Hardwick decision. "You start out at the beginning, then get wary and go the last mile. When you see the end, you've got to push. What will history say about us, we homosexuals, if we go on? If we stop, we will never know for sure, and if we lose, it will be worse." Determined to make the most out of the situation, Baker would spend the next few years traveling across the state, meeting with gay organizations and civil rights groups from Houston to towns as small as Plano in West Texas to encourage further mobilization and possible challenges to 2106 in the future. Yet Baker was quick to state that, quote, "I'm no martyr. People think that I'm some crusader, but I'm not. But I feel that I have a responsibility. I have to say we brought something to Texas and make a better understanding of gay people. You have to look in the long term, not the short term." While Baker continued to have hope for the future, the situation with AIDS continued to worsen over the last several years of the 1980s. In 1987, Texas had surpassed Florida as the #3 state with the most AIDS cases, with over 1,400 in Houston and 885 in Dallas. By the end of 1989 and the beginning of 1990, those numbers in both cities had doubled, with 2,500 in Houston and with 2,500 cases in Houston, of which 1,500 had died. And in Dallas, there were now over 1,300 cases with 840 deaths. For Baker, the statistics would hit close to home as he witnessed many of his friends and fellow political activists who had risen to leadership positions in the Dallas gay community die during those harrowing years. Longtime friend and Dallas Gay Political Caucus member Bill Nelson and his partner Terry Tobito would both die by 1990, and Steve Wilkins, another co-founder, would succumb in 1992. And as you can see here from this slide here, this is one of the many publications and publications discussing the rising number of AIDS cases in Texas, both in Houston and abroad. And by the end of the 1980s, pretty much everybody in the community knew someone, whether that be a lover or a friend, who had died of the disease. These losses, along with the continuing legal and activist efforts to overturn 2106, was slowly draining Baker emotionally. And by the end of the 1980s, he had decided to pull back from his activist efforts to focus on his family and his partner, stating that, quote, "I want to be more than Don Baker, the activist. It has been fulfilling, but it has also been limiting for people who want to see me only as that." While Baker calmed people, asserting that he was not giving up the cause by any means, he said that, quoting, that it was a mistake for people to think that if I temper my involvement, that in any way states that I am done. No way. There is still a long way to go. I'll be very tempted to jump right back in and take on a new issue in the future if it suits me. During the 1990s, Baker and his partner Michael Hartwig moved to Boston, where he would spend the rest of his life. Yet Texas and its gay communities were never far from Baker's mind, and he would frequently return over the years, whether it was to offer moral support and guidance for legal activists in the 2106 battle, or to meet friends and attend the funeral services of those who died of AIDS, which you can see here on the right, attending the funeral of Steve Wilkins. In a correspondence with friend and local community historian Phil Johnson in 1997, Baker proudly stated throughout all the trials and tribulations of the 2106 years, I am so emotionally linked to my years in gay Dallas and the DGC and the Dallas Gay Political Caucus that no matter how hard I try to let it go, it still possesses me. Everybody is a part of me. In 2000, after a 6-year battle with cancer, Don Baker passed away. It was tragically ironic that a man who had fought so hard for all of his adult life for legalizing homosexuality would not live to see the ultimate success of this fight. A mere 3 years after his death, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled in its landmark decision of Lawrence v. Texas, which ironically was another case involving the Texas sodomy law, that finally declared sodomy laws unconstitutional on the grounds of it violating a person's right to privacy between two consenting adults. While much of the historical attention over the issue of sodomy laws in the United States has tended to focus on the significance of the Lawrence v. Texas case and the Bowers v. Hardwick case, more recent historical efforts have been made to bring the efforts of others like Don Baker into the historiographical conversation. In LGBT historian Lillian Faderman's 2015 landmark synthesis history of LGBT history, The Gay Revolution, she acknowledged the significance of Baker's legal battle, arguing that it was a pivotal moment for both Texas and American LGBT citizens. Karen Wisely's examination of Dallas's gay community in 2011 also urged for recognition of Baker versus Wade, arguing that despite its ultimate defeat in 1986 due to the Bowers decision, it not only allowed lesbians and gay men to feel the freedom to be more open about their sexuality without reprisal, but also laid the groundwork for future challenges to the 2106 battle that would eventually be used by the very legal team in the Lawrence v. Texas case. While these new historiographical recognitions are important, I argue that there needs to be a much more dedicated examination of the historical legacy of both Baker and his legal fight to overturn Texas's sodomy law, as it's not only an area that has received so little attention, it also has the potential to be expanded upon for the richness of Southern LGBT history. Thank you.
All right. Thanks. So we have a little bit of time left. I'll try to keep my comments relatively brief so that we can have some time to have Q&A if possible. But just as a reminder, when I wrote my comments, I didn't have Rhys's paper, so these comments only address Alecia and Tim's paper. So if we can, include him in the conversation afterwards, that would be great. So these two papers that I had by Alecia Long and Tim Vale tell stories of various kinds of men. Men who preferred sex with men who preferred sex with women, men who were scared of difference, men who celebrated difference, men who wanted power, men who were victims, and men who were, quote, articulate, dignified, respectable, well-versed, or at least trainable in constitutional issues, and well-liked and admired in their communities. Judges, lawyers, activists, police, teachers, AIDS victims, conspiratorialists, and even one assassinated president. In short, this is the stuff of history, the history of sexuality, the history of the American South, the history of the law, and the history of the incredibly creative, voyeuristic, moralizing, fearful, and powerful American sexual imagination. The stories that Long and Vale so eloquently lay out are stories about power, the power of incantation, the power to create imaginary folk devils and threats where none may have existed, the power to inflame moral imaginations of district attorneys and judges and legislators who made laws that shaped people's real lives. These are also stories about these real people whose lives were shaped by these men and their attempts to create and maintain and police the boundaries of a pure Christian America. Clay Shaw, Clay Bertrand, David Ferry, quote, Johnny or Frank, a Negro male, end quote. Don Baker, Mort Schwab. Alecia and Tim have done really great service that only historians can do by giving character and structure to these now dead people, by placing them into their context and explaining to us why they matter and why we should not forget them. These stories, though they give voice to their actors, also call our attention to the silences, the empty spaces, the unspoken. One of the terrifying and also fascinating aspects of the history of sexuality is that we still haven't really decided what or who our subject is. Is it queer people? Is it the law? Is it the archive? Is it us? Is this history acted out in queer subculture, the dominant American culture, nightclubs, big cities, rural spaces, mega churches? Subjectivity is a problem for us. So is objectivity. As such, the stories that we tell are always as noteworthy for what they include as for what they leave out. Alecia long alighted on the small task of teaching us something new about the JFK assassination. In a brilliant stroke, she calls our attention not to the grassy knoll or the book depository, but, quote, the ways in which men who had sex with men were legally defined, socially constructed, intensively policed, and culturally pathologized in the decades following World War II, end quote. One might reasonably wonder, what does this have to do with JFK? This is why it's a brilliant stroke, because it calls our attention to something invisible, conspiracy. Long's move here brings to mind Mark Fenster's great work on conspiracy theory, in which he argues that we shouldn't dismiss them as pathological or irrational, but actually analyze them as breathless, frenzied articulation of American populism and rage. What Long asks us to consider is how the anti-gay American imagination animates JFK conspiracy theory. In her words, quote, this history of the Shaw Garrison affair illuminates how ideas about sexuality initially took hold and still lurk in popular beliefs about the assassination and its causes. I'm not sure what my comments might be here or how useful they'll be since the book is already out, but perhaps in the service of our conversation, I had a few questions that came to mind as I read this. One, of course, is the fact that Clay Shaw picked up, quote, Johnny or Frank, a Negro male. What was the role of interracial sex in this story? Would it have made a difference to Garrison if Shaw only went with white men? And in a bigger picture, were those New Orleans reformers who are so concerned about homosexuality also concerned about interracial homosexuality? We know so much about Southern history and the ways that interracial heterosex was policed as a way to police a biracial South. But what about interracial homosex? What does that mean for Southern history and for the history of sexuality? My other comment, my other thought, and I need to read the whole book probably, and I'd get my answer, is that the focus of this introduction is on the criminalizing, pathologizing, and homophobic currents of the story. I wondered also about the spectacle, the voyeuristic currents of the story. In other words, does some of Clay Shaw's power come not just from Americans being anti-gay in general, but from him being who he was? When we meet him in the story, we meet a, quote, strikingly handsome, barrel-chested, preternaturally tanned man, end quote. And I found myself thinking of this whole story as, yes, about homophobia, but also about theater, about power, about mutuality. I want to know more about the dynamic ways that power flows in this story, not just from the DA and the media and the police, but also right back at them. In his paper, Tim Vale argues that though Don Baker has been mentioned in recent work by Federman and Wisely, his story needs to be told more fully. And, quote, there needs to be a much more dedicated examination of the historical legacy of Baker and his legal fight to overturn Texas sodomy law. Don Baker, as Vale outlines in his story, was centrally involved in the legal history of gay rights in Texas, most notably in Judge Jerry Buckmeyer's 1981 decision, a decision that essentially presaged Lawrence versus Texas that the Supreme Court would issue over 20 years later. How tragic Bowers versus Hardwick must have felt to him in 1986 and during the 17 years that followed. How keenly Baker must have felt what we historians are always trying to chart: roads not taken, forays and retreats, unintended consequence, multiple layers of causation, the tragic aspect of history. Vale's treatment of Baker is biographical in a straightforward, chronological way, and as such affords him some of the best opportunities that a historical writer has. For in biography, you have a predetermined chronology, a central character, a narrative that moves somewhat predictably through time and space. So what I would want to know, should Vale continue with this project and develop it into a book project, is what is the big question that Don Baker's life wants us to ask? What is the historical question that such a biography would answer? Is this a story about political activism? A story about the law in Texas and America? Is it a story about religion and sexuality? Obviously, it's a story about all these things, but as this develops into a living, breathing biography, I would press the question about theme and what the big themes of his life story are. And then lastly, Don Baker's experience with the Dallas Independent School District it immediately sounds echoes of the Johns Committee in my own state of Florida. This context suggests that Baker's story might also be a way into understanding the tangled history of anti-communism, the Lavender Scare, and the ways that state governments and school boards sought to protect children from what they saw as a sexual threat. And here these two papers reconverge. The fear of homosexuality has animated the imaginations of lawmakers and homemakers and school teachers in this country. It has changed over time. It has ebbed and flowed, and its history doesn't follow a linear path. But these projects call our attention to the incongruous pockets of Southern history, the multi-layered dynamics of power. They direct our gaze onto the irrational psyche, the place where conspiracy and secrets and fear animate human motivation. But they also direct it to public spectacle, the news conference, the courtroom, the classroom. The stories can teach us about big things like Lawrence versus Texas and the assassination of JFK, but they can also do so by introducing us to historical characters we've never met. In doing so, they can provide a light that we might shine onto our own perilous path that we find ourselves on here in 2021, here in our own home states of Texas and Louisiana and Florida. Okay, so if we want to take a minute, I don't know if you guys want to talk for a minute in response, or if those of you in the audience want to type questions into the Q&A or the chat. Maybe, as I'm guessing, that might take a minute to type in these questions. If you guys, Alecia and Timothy or Rhys, if you guys have anything to add, haven't heard all these papers. Thank you guys, by the way, for these great papers. I guess technically we're out of time, but since this is a fake conference, this is like an artificial thing we're doing here. We don't have to be anywhere. There's no coffee unless you made some in your office.
Yeah, Ben, I'd just say thank you for the comment and kind of lyrical, beautiful comment. Thank you. It's a lot like your book on Percy.
Thank you.
And so I appreciate that. No, I'll just say this question of interracial homosex and the role that it's playing in this, there were so many strands to pick up in the book and sort of try to hold together. It was extremely complicated, and this is something that, I raise, but I don't ever spend a whole lot of time on. And it is something that I think deserves more attention at some point. So thank you for raising that. I appreciate that.
Yeah. Well, it's bad timing for me to be asking you questions about a book that came out a month ago. There's nothing you can do about it
You
now.
can wait no longer.
Yeah. Yeah. And Tim, where does this project fit for you in your bigger, I know you sort of mentioned this wasn't actually a part of your dissertation. Is this something you're thinking about writing a full biography of, or maybe making it into a book chapter? Or?
Yeah, the way it works, since just to clarify here, I'm no LGBT legal historian here. My specialty is in medicine, and I happened to find this while I was in North Texas doing research, and I happened to stumble across it because an archivist there told me, hey, I know you're working on this, but you might want to check out this. You might find some related material, and lo and behold, I found this huge collection dedicated to just Don Baker. He's collected a wide variety of materials, and Ben, on your point about the linkage between anti-communism and school boards and stuff like that, Baker did actually, I think, have a few collection materials where he took a very big interest in when he was still a school teacher on how to be presentable, how to writing notes for himself. Like, he was a meticulous note writer about like how to avoid giving off signs that I'm homosexual or whatnot. And I could definitely see something like along the lines, like if ultimately I decide to go with a larger project on it to discuss, the effects of the homosexual panic in school districts, the linkage between anti-communism, the Lavender Scare, and as well as the rise of Southern evangelicalism, all played a role in shaping Baker's mindset. Because, ironically, even throughout this whole process, he still maintained his Christian faith, and but still, at the very, it's sort of like a weird balancing act that he's spent his whole life trying to do, trying to maintain his devout image while at the same time being a gay legal activist. And some people in the community would criticize him for that, saying that, isn't that hypocritical of you to do that? But for Baker, he saw no distinction between the two. He said that you can be a Christian and still be a gay activist at the same time. So I think these are interesting threads that you brought up, Ben, that I think are worth exploring. Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, should you have world enough and time, this seems like his life is an occasion to narrate the modern gay rights movement and the rise of the Christian right and the AIDS crisis and the legal history from 1970 to Obergefell. I mean, there's a really a lot of historical themes that his life touches on that seem really fascinating. So why not write 2 books?
Absolutely.
Well, I'm not seeing, it looks like in the chat, unless I'm missing something, I'm not seeing any. Do anybody in the audience have any questions for these fantastic papers that we've just heard? We can wait another minute or so, and then if not, we can go network. I noticed there's a network tab on the side. All right. Well, thank you guys again. Another round of applause for our presenters. This was really great, and I'm glad I got to be a part of it. So I guess we'll shut it down now. all the best to you three and these projects. Best to you, Alecia, with the new life of your book, with all the people reading it and writing about it now. So that I'm sure it will be great. So I will press leave now and shut down this thing, and hope to see you guys again soon.
Bye.
All right. Bye, everybody.
Bye, guys.